What I have here is a counter component built in React, and the logic of that component is powered by XState. And so if we jump over here, we can see we have a very minimal state machine that's powering this counter component. And what this allows us to do is increment a counter by clicking a button. So I can click that a few times and you see the counter increment. Now this component, as I said, is pretty minimal, but I think what it gives us a chance to do is see an important concept that XState gives us access to, and that is a self-transition. So that is a type of transition that we can do, and XState is all about transition. State machines are all about transitions. They allow us to move from one state to another. But sometimes we want to stay in the current state we are in while doing some sort of action. And that is what a self-transition allows us to do. So if I jump back over here, we can see that the only state that this machine has is counting. So there's nowhere else to transition to. So when this event occurs, when an increment event is received, this state is going to transition to itself, which we call self-transition. Now there are two kinds of self-transitions. There are internal self-transitions and there are external self-transitions. So let's look a little bit at the difference between those two things. Right now we are implicitly going to be an internal self-transition. And the reason for that is because we have not specified a target. Often when you are defining an event that you're going to respond to and it involves transitioning to another state, you're going to define a target, which basically says when this event is received, the target that I'm going to transition to is some other state. But in this case, we don't have that. And that's our first signal to tell us that this is a self-transition and that it's an internal self-transition. So instead of transitioning to another state, we're still going to get some sort of response to our event, and that is these two different actions. So the one action is to increment the count, and that uses an assign action to actually change the value of the count in our context. And then there is also a log event, which is doing nothing more than doing a console.log. And this is a way for us to see in the browser that as I click the event, we can see that these are happening. One of the main differences between an internal self-transition and an external self-transition is that an external one is going to trigger both entry and exit actions, whereas an internal self-transition is not going to trigger those. And so we can see a demonstration of that. Let's comment these actions back in, and then let's add these in as an entry action. We'll do log entry, and that will correspond to this thing down on line 25. And then we'll also do an exit action. So if we were to exit the counting state, we'd see this particular console log message, which corresponds to the log exit action. So I'm going to save that and jump back over to my counter, and I'm going to refresh the page. And now we see immediately we enter the counting state. And that's because when our state machine boots up and is interpreted, it's going to immediately go to the initial state, which is counting, and that's going to trigger this entry action. However, after that initial entry action, because we're doing internal self-transitions, we can do count, 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 and we're not going to see any entering or exiting. Whereas, if I target myself, if I have this event target itself rather, that's now going to make it into a external self-transition, and we can see that take effect here. So we've entered, and then each time we count, you can imagine us like circling around and coming back into the counting state. And so it's going to exit itself, and then it's going to come and enter right back into itself. And so we can see that happen each time as we click as we trigger the increment event. Now, if I want to be really explicit that this is an internal transition and not an external one, I can say internal true. And now if I jump back over here, despite even having set the target, I'm not going to see the entering and exiting on subsequent events. And that's because we specified internal as true. Now, I don't think it makes too much sense to specify both of these at the same time. If your target is yourself, you should just leave it as that. And if you want to specify whether it's an internal, external one, you can say false or you can say true. And I would even say that the internal true is sort of a level of explicitness that is probably only necessary if you want to sort of call out that there are entry and exit actions that aren't going to be triggered by these self transitions. If there are entry and exit actions that aren't in play, it is probably just enough to leave it at just the actions, and you can see at a glance, hey, there's no target, this is an internal self transition. I guess it depends on how explicit you want to be, how clear you want the definition of your state machine to communicate the type of self transition that's happening.